Africa. And we are committed long-term investors here. We've got many UK companies attending this week's event as an illustration of the interest and the commitment that we have collectively as a nation to this continent. Now, some 15 months ago, the UK government announced a scale-up of our investment in Africa through £3.5 billion worth of additional funds to our development finance institution, CDC, to spend in Africa on top of their existing funds already allocated to this continent. Now, as part of that increased investment profile, last year CDC invested £138 million in liquid telecom as part of the expansion of broadband connectivity across this continent, something we all know is absolutely critical to the future success of this continent. Also earlier this year, CDC announced its financing of £52 million to help construction of a new solar energy plant in Malindi, Kenya. In addition to CDC, we have our UK Export Finance Agency, our export credit agency, and that's increased its risk appetite in Africa and its presence as well as a way to help more commercial deals with UK content get over the line. And one of the highly competitive aspects of UK export finance is that we require just a minimum of just 20% UK content in any deal, which I think, as I said, is highly competitive. So over the last year, we've seen UK Export Finance supporting projects in Angola for the first time ever, some £400 million to help that country build 3 new hospitals and upgrade 2 power plants, so improving healthcare and power provision in Angola. And it's the UK's intention to mobilise this public sector investment to de-risk wider investment and to crowd in the many billions of pounds that sit within the UK's private sector, including the flows through the City of London. As the UK, we advocate and support responsible and inclusive business practices. This includes making sure that we are actively considering the impact of all of our investments on economic empowerment of women and girls, for example, and in line with our wider national commitments on climate change and supporting the realisation of the Sustainable Development Goals, our UK investments are focused on being green, sustainable and transformative, so that we're using technological innovations to invest for a cleaner, greener future. And we're doing this through projects like Cape 3 Points in Ghana, where UK Export Finance has enabled the transformational development of gas reserves expected to generate 1,100 megawatts of power for at least the next 2 decades. This supports Ghana's energy security, and it helps it achieve its COP21 commitments for climate mitigation by displacing heavy oil fuel use. So this is taking the equivalent of 1.2 million cars off of Ghana's roads each year, or it's the equivalent of planting 152 million trees. And when we look at the UK's investments in Africa, we don't just look at the pound signs, important as these seem to be for many. We look beyond the statistics and the capital flows, and we're looking at the fuller story of how the UK, through its public and its private sector investment, is helping people all across Africa to realise their potential, including through things like scholarships, partnerships, community and leadership initiatives. So it's the stories like that of Jaguar Land Rover, whose apprenticeship scheme here in South Africa is enabling young adults from previously disadvantaged backgrounds to become some of the best young engineers in the world. And it's the work of companies like Globelec, the largest private developer, owner and operator of 8 independent power plants in 5 African countries. And alongside each of their renewable power plants, Globelec has support programs for local communities in areas like health, education, employment and enterprise development. In the UK, we understand the important role that investment can play in creating and sustaining jobs and helping companies to grow. And it's no coincidence that we see many political leaders here this week, because it's through investment that we make the biggest, most positive impact. And that is our aim as the United Kingdom, to have the greatest impact through our investments, here. And it is with this aim in mind that the UK will host a number of African heads of state and business leaders, along with UK investors and international institutions, in London this coming January for our UK Africa Investment Summit. And this will showcase existing investments, it will provide a platform to promote new investment opportunities, and it will showcase the UK's unique offer to Africa, including the City of London's position as a world-class financial centre. And we hope that our summit, just like this one, will be a catalyst for inspiring more UK investment into this extraordinary continent that we call home. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Emma. I think I'll stand here because I can see you better and sort of straining my neck. So what I would like to do now is to ask each of our panelists to give a short introduction to their company and what they're doing currently on the African continent. So can I start with Matt at the end?
Great, thanks, Paul. Good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure to be with you here today. My name is Matt Reese, and I'm the Interim Coordinator for Prosper Africa. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what Prosper Africa is, what it represents to our partnership with Africa, and then what it means for each of you as a private sector investor, as a private sector company. So Prosper Africa is this administration's initiative to substantially increase two-way trade and investment with Africa. It's that two-way trade and investment that I hope really stands out, because two-way trade means mutual economic growth, means simultaneous benefit, and it means partnership. And I think what the Prosper Africa Initiative aims to highlight is that for decades, the U.S. government relationship, primarily with Africa, has been discussed in and around humanitarian assistance, around technical assistance, around PEPFAR, and around really well-intended discussions and outcomes that are aiming to create sustainable development outcomes, but from a public sector point of view. And what Prosper Africa aims to do is change that forever, to move our relationship and our first conversation, our first foot in the door, away from humanitarian assistance and relief and towards investment and mutual economic growth. How are we going to do that? Well, we've got 16 U.S. government agencies under the banner of Prosper Africa that all have some key tool to offer, whether it's our United States Trade and Development Agency that can do feasibility studies, or our Department of Commerce for commercial advocacy, USAID for technical assistance and transaction advisory assistance to identify deals, or our new Development Finance Corporation with a doubling of its ceiling to $60 billion in investment and finance potential on the African continent. This is the new offer of the United States government to fundamentally changing our relationship with Africa from one of aid to one of trade. What this means in very practical terms is that the Prosper Africa Initiative and all 16 of its U.S. government agencies will be working across three pillars. Pillar number one, transactions, transactions, and more transactions. We are set up keenly with every embassy on the African continent has established a deal team. And that deal team is to work with you in the field to identify what are those priority transactions, identify the constraints to those transactions, whether it be a policy reform or a finance constraint or a feasibility study constraint or some other type of technical barrier to advancing that deal to financial close. We've got great success with this in the Power Africa program. Since 2013, taking this model, we have brought over 120 transactions to financial close, some of which there, Mr. Hanks has had the benefit of. We're thankful for your partnership in that.
Yeah, thank you.
And also, the value of those deals is roughly $20 billion. That's $20 billion in private capital, displacing the need to take on additional debt to substantially increase energy generation in Africa, close to the tune of something around over 10,000 megawatts. That increased by a third the total generation capacity in Africa since 2013. That model is what we aim to expand and bring to the rest of our relationship with Africa so that infrastructure, healthcare, tourism, education no longer need to take a debt approach to financing the sustainable development of Africa, and that there can be mutual benefit on both sides of the ocean in order to achieve this. So, transactions is what we're focused on. Policy reform is the technical assistance that we're here to provide. And then lastly, The third pillar is Prosper Africa in and itself, is that you shouldn't have to learn how to navigate Washington in order to do business in Africa. So 16 government agencies, all under the umbrella of Prosper Africa, easy to find if you're in Washington, easy to find if you're in Africa. Call your deal team at every U.S. embassy. And we're very hopeful and reliant upon each and every one of you to make Prosper Africa a success. Because other than the Development Finance Corporation, the U.S. government doesn't export. The U.S. government doesn't export or manufacture. And only does the DFC invest. It's each one of the private sector companies in this room today who is going to make Prosper Africa a success, and we really look forward to working with you.
That's great, Matt. We'll be coming back to discuss some of that in more detail. Just one point I would like to make. You don't want to try and navigate Washington at the moment. So it's much better that you're dealing with the embassies. Fareed.
Yes. Yes, good morning. So my name is Fareed Fezwa. So I lead GE for Sub-Saharan Africa and GE Healthcare for, as a P&L, as you call it, for the whole of the continent of Africa. So GE, global infrastructure company, traditionally everything from power to healthcare to aviation, transportation, and oil and gas. More recently, more focused as part of the portfolio move in the power sector, very much so, across the different type of power solution, from gas to renewable grid solutions, and also coal-fired power plant steam technology, which is still has a large install base in the continent, including in this country, as well as aviation, still very much engaged into the aircraft engine and the aircraft leasing and aircraft management and service and maintenance, and healthcare. Healthcare, a lot traditionally in the diagnostic imaging, but has grown into the life science spaces. And everything we do around this sector is not about just the technology, it's about the development and early development of the overall solution to deliver, whether it's power to consumers, whether it's services to patients, or flying people from one place to another. So in a nutshell, that's GE. We've been 120 years in this continent. We actually set foot here for the first time 120 years ago, 1898. I don't know if you know, but Thomas Edison actually opened the first overseas branch of this company at the time here in Johannesburg in 1898. So we're celebrating that last year and this year. Our commitment to Africa has continued. We're about 2,500 employees just in sub-Saharan Africa. We have operations in 25 sites and locations. It's all Africans. 95% of our employee force is from the different countries of Africa. And we're proud to have developed over the years our capabilities for both GE, but also within the supplier development space that is critical for what we do. Also in terms of developing very strong local partnership. So just in terms of numbers, I mentioned these sectors. In power, we're about 80% of the installed base in gas. We're a third of the installed base in hydro. In healthcare, we've got about 50,000 medical devices throughout sub-Saharan Africa only, currently running in all hospitals and healthcare facilities. And we power about 60% of the Ethiopian Airlines fleet, 90% of Kenya Airways fleet, 100% of TAG. And if you look at the low-cost airline through the medium body range of 737 and Airbus 320 with our CFM engine, which is a joint venture between GE and Safran in France, we power most of these medium body aircraft. So that's, in a nutshell, what GE is globally and in Africa.
And having done business with GE over many, many years, I can tell you it's a phenomenal, amazing company, and it still is today. Maury.
Yes. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mutsuya Mori, Vice President of Japan International Cooperation Agency. Some of them might know our JICA. We had several decades working with African countries through government-to-government cooperations, such as technical assistance, grant aid, and concessional loans. As for that concessional loans, at this moment we have around 60 ongoing projects over the African continent. And this is our main business until now. This year, Japanese government had a conference in Tokyo Conference for Development Africa. We called it TICAT. One of the agreement, everybody think, private sector is the key for further development of Africa. Government can support, but main load should take by the private sectors. A couple of years ago, we started expanding our facility, not only to government, but also we start to cooperate with private sectors. Actually, we can provide that loan, bank loan, corporate loan, project finance, as well as we can make that investment to private enterprises or fund operations. We would like to use this private sector windows for development for Africa. And at this time, I really appreciate FDB to introduce JICA from the Asia and give us a chance to explain that our facility. I believe that this private corporation facility can reduce the risk of private enterprise working in Africa. Couple of the points I'd like to add for this scheme. We are a Japanese government agency. However, Japanese company is not conditioned for us to support any nationality company we can work with. In Brazil, we have that loan to the agriculture company, as well as that we have a loan to the Vietnam company in agriculture or human resource development. We really prefer any countries, Japan, joint venture, or another entities. So this is the first point. And as I mentioned, we have already worked, your government, this continent, more than several decades. And we have that network. So whenever we make that terms, we don't put on that country risk. Normally that the company, financial institution should put that country risk. But for our terms, without no country risk, this we take by us. So this is my explanation to that JICA and the new JICA facility for private facility. Through this panel discussion, we'd like to elaborate more about our activity, and I'd like to find out how we can cooperate with the private sectors. Thank you.
Thank you, Murray. And again, from my own experience, having partnered with some Japanese companies in the past, I can tell you quite honestly that they're probably amongst the best that I've ever worked alongside. Fantastic people to work with. So we're looking forward to that private sector investment. Shankar, who's been around Africa for a very long time and knows how to invest on this continent.
Yeah.
Over to you.
Thank you. Good morning. I mean, all the previous speakers deal in the tens of billions, if not the hundreds of billions. I'm that small guy to just bring a little bit of normality to this panel. Good morning. I'm Shankar. I run a private equity fund. We are less than 5 years old. We're just a shade over 4 years old, called Gateway Partners. We invest across Africa, Middle East, South and Southeast Asia. We invest into growth situations, so we don't necessarily invest into greenfield projects. We invest into existing companies with robust cash flows. We are also big believers in investing into companies that produce goods and services that are consumed by the vast majority of the populations in our markets. We also believe in investing into very basic themes So we are big believers in investing in biscuits, not bitcoins. We also like to invest in companies that make actual real profits and cash flows, therefore no bitcoins. We have no hard allocation as such for Africa. Our first fund, which we launched in 2015, is about $750 million. Having said that, it so happens that in our first fund, almost 40% of the fund is invested in Africa across a range of sectors. So we invested into Dangote Cement, the largest cement company on the continent. Liquid Telecom, we were actually the first investor, and we have great partners now with CDC, which is the largest optic fiber and data center network in Africa. We have also established a real estate development company for Africa. It's called Gateway Delta, in partnership with PIC, the Sovereign Wealth Fund of South Africa, and Grit, who is a real estate developer from here, from South Africa. And we're also investing into oil and gas transaction in Nigeria. So it's across a broad range of sectors. If you were to take the unifying theme across all of them, what we find exciting about Africa and the Africa story compelling is the fact that you got a young and growing population. This is the world capital of the next gen and the millennials. 75% of the population under the age of 35. The second attractive feature of Africa we find is the urbanization. And despite the fact it's rapidly urbanizing, there are 25 cities in Africa with a population of more than 1 million which don't even have a single mall. And ultimately, Africa is getting connected to the world. And as the previous speakers mentioned, Africa is pretty much part of what I call the new South-South trade and investment corridor, which is developing. And Africa has to be a very important part of the story moving forward. I'll stop there.
Thank you. So let's move into a session of questions that I will ask. And I want to tell you a little story about the briefing session I went to the other day for the moderators. So we went there, and we were told in that we have to be focused on transactions. So I sort of scratched my head and thought, how the hell am I going to produce a transaction, a tangible transaction out of this panel? Well, I've thought of a few intangible transactions that we might be able to come to at the end of the panel, and I'll tell you guys about them, and if you agree, we'll at least have an intangible transaction. Okay, so also, I don't like to do too much just speaking from the panel. It'll be great if we can have a lively Q&A from the audience and bring in some people from the audience. I know quite a few of you. So if you don't want to be asked a question by me, you may leave now. What we should do is operationalize this discussion. I think you've heard just now, there's 3 government representatives, the UK, Japan, and the United States on the panel. And what I've learned in the last 24 hours and listening to them now is that all of them are pivoting away from the traditional development aid that they all do in huge amounts, and they're pivoting towards getting behind the private sector. And I'd imagine that I'm like you, many people in this audience, what we want to know is, what are you going to do for me? And how is that going to help me in my endeavors to invest in Africa, whether I have money, my own equity at the moment, or I don't have money, but I have a great project. And so I want to have 2 discussions throughout the panel session. One's going to be, of course, on the big projects, the millions, the tens of millions, hundreds of millions, whatever. But we always tend to forget that there's another scale, another end to this, which is also, I would say, the smaller investments. And unfortunately, a lot of people in Africa, I go around the continent a lot, I see a lot of great ideas, people with land, people with buildings that they can't finish off, and they're looking for money, and they go and ask for money, and they need $1 million, or they need 500,000, and they're told it's too small. So I want to have a little discussion about that, particularly with the government people, and what can be done there. But I'm going to start with Matt. I know a little bit about Prosper Africa. what I understand, and based upon my previous experiences again, is I can go to an organization which is part of that community called the US Trade and Development Agency, because I have an idea. I want to build a small hotel. And I can ask them to finance my feasibility study. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct.
So what are the conditions for that? What do I have to do to meet the conditions? If I'm an investor in any of the African countries, I approach you through the embassy. Tell us about how to do that quick.
Right, so let's play this through. That's a great example. Let's say I am an investor in East Africa. I've got a bit of experience in the hotel industry. I want to capitalize on the growing interest in that economy, and I've got a good amount of capital behind me, but it's that very prohibitive working capital from go that is making me drag my feet, having me look around and up over the fences trying to find out how am I going to get this done. So you'd reach out to your embassy. Let's play this through in the Kenyan context. Reach out to your embassy, your deal team there will take a bit of your information and very quickly try to get you to that value add conversation with the appropriate US government agency. In this case, the United States Trade and Development Agency. They are set up for 3 key outcomes, all under the auspices of trying to help a project go from greenfield and concept towards bankability, right? So USTDA has a couple main tools. 1, feasibility studies. 2, environmental assessments. And 3, they also do trade missions so that perhaps you could also find that additional U.S. content, U.S. innovative, I guess you would call it technology, and or additional investors. So let's, again, back to your original point. I need some additional or early stage working capital to do my environmental assessment so that the hotel of my dreams can come to fruition. It's a very simple application process that could be facilitated there by the embassy. You put it out. They have a couple open calls throughout the season, but also can do a near-term consideration of a particular project when it's been prioritized.
Yeah, but there's a condition, isn't there? That the feasibility study must be done by an American company.
That's right. So the feasibility study, the tie back to U.S. content and to the U.S. benefit here is that the feasibility study must be done by a U.S. firm. But they've got a list of those firms that are on the spot, ready to go. That is not a constraint whatsoever. So it's American investment in the African economy with a benefit back to a U.S. firm.
Yeah, and I'll give you a quick example. I'm helping somebody at the moment from Madagascar who's interested in doing ethanol in Madagascar. He went to a conference in the US, I think in Las Vegas or somewhere, went to a conference, he met a US consultant who can do a feasibility study, and now he's going to approach USTDA to see if they will pay for that feasibility study.
Is David Raposo in the room? I don't want to call him out, and he'll have like 50 business cards. He's at another meeting right now. He is USTDA's representative here with you this week.
So the way to think about that is, if you're looking for a small amount of money to do that front-end work, they're the people to approach, and they do a lot of it. They do a lot of it. I'm going to come back to you. Okay, Maury, the same question put to you. Now JICA has pivoted towards private sector financing. My first question is that restricted the private sector to Japanese companies? And what do you want to see?
No. Any country.
That's a good answer.
Enterprise. It's easy.
But are we right in saying that if we partner with a Japanese company, it makes it more interesting for JICA?
Of course, preferable.
Okay. So tell us what, in Matt's case, he tells us we go to the embassy, and they lead us to USTDA. Tell us how it works in JICA.
As for the JICA, particularly for the private sector windows, we wish is you will contact to first our representative office in African continent. We have 31 offices here. So first information, first exchange of the view, you can have there, and that information transferred to Japan simultaneously. So that is one of the way. And the other thing is that, as I said, we started this operation several years ago. So our accumulation knowledge for private sector in Africa, unfortunately, is still limited. So we welcome to that co-finance with other countries' DFI or private bank. For example, in agriculture in Brazil, as I mentioned, we co-finance Citibank. So these banks might have some connections to Japanese bank, and they can easily commit sending the information to us, or maybe some international bank branches can easily connect to some of our representative office. So you don't need to go through this time the embassy, just come to JICA. So this is a way of doing. And whenever you have that feasibility study, it does not need to be prepared by Japan. Your own resources is enough. If you make it by your own resources, it is okay. And once we find out the business is interesting, and in the case that the Japanese company involved in that, we can provide some supplemental budget for making that detailed design, for making the detailed feasibility studies.
We've got an idea of USTDA for now, scale. What scale project can I bring to you?
Actually, it depends on our loan facility or equity investment. As for the loan facility, maybe the 150 million USD is one of our milk mile. So if that amount is not enough, we really prefer to make that co-finance with another lenders. As for that equity investment, for typical from our past experience for private equity investment is at most at 20 million USD. On the other side, when we make that equity investment to the fund, at most at this moment 50 million USD. But this is at the current level. So we like to double our commitment within 3 years. So based on this, our strategy, of course, we have to discuss in detail to which limit we can our board accept or not.
Okay, thank you. Emma, can you explain to us the sort of similar answer to how Japan and the US is working, how the UK is working at the moment?
Yeah, thank you. So we have trade and investment teams across 23 countries in Africa, and that is a 20% increase over the last 8 months. And embedded usually in our embassies and our high commissions across the continent. So I really like the way, Matt, that you described these as deal teams. And I think that's certainly how we sort of see ourselves, and bringing in together not just that sort of front end and connecting you to the right ministers and so on in country, but really linking in across the whole of the UK government capability, whether that's kind of longer term economic development programming, which runs to hundreds of millions of pounds across Africa, through to some of our slightly shorter term, more agile work through what we call the Prosperity Fund, which is looking at more sort of immediate sort of facilitation of business environment to improve the flow of deals, through to that kind of front-end stuff that the trade and investment officers do across the continent. So we sort of have this combined package, which is looking not just at the deals right in front of our noses, but how do we create that, how do we support the aspirations of African governments across the continent to diversify, to deepen, to sort of build capacity and capability, to build the markets of the future, and not just deal with the ones of today. There's, as I say, there's sort of this longer term stuff, things like Trademark East Africa, which I think is a fairly well-known UK government programme, multi-year, looking at East Africa, clearly, named the clues in the title, but really helping over the last few years to dramatically reduce the cost and the time it takes to do business in East Africa, to move a container from Mombasa port through the East African community, to reduce the friction at border points, And that is the kind of practical programming work that the UK government has been doing to improve that business environment, not just for UK companies, but of course for any company, hopefully an increasing number of African companies, as well as further sort of global international ones. And I think we also have a very strong approach to cooperation. So strong sense of kind of working with local companies, helping to build local supply chains, and work together across sort of SMEs, as well as international cooperation. And I think UK companies work really well internationally, whether it's with Japanese companies, Chinese companies, American companies, and so on. And a strong commitment to improving that. So I think we look at that holistically. Also, if you look at trade and investment advisors, we're here to work with you directly to understand what are your business aspirations in Africa. Can we work with you to expand those, as well as deliver on your immediate interests? And we do that deploying the hundreds of millions of pounds that the UK government has to invest in the African continent at a big sort of strategic level, as well as a sort of more niche operational level.
And I think it's a statement just in the fact that you are based in Johannesburg on the African continent. It's a statement of the UK's intentions, which I think is great. Fareed, I want to discuss something specific about what I know about GE's methodology from the past. In the past, I've heard that what you will do, using your, let's call it, convening power and brand, you will help develop projects, join forces with a local developer and perhaps an EPC contractor or something like this. And what you'll do is help that project get to financial close, and that you'll invest a certain amount of money. Can I get some, or can we get some clarity on what that actually means? So, how much will GE invest? If people have projects in health or in power or in railways or whatever, how do we approach you?
Yeah. So maybe what I would say is, we clearly know what our role is and what our role is not. And we're not an operator. So we're not a developer in power. Exactly. We're not a utility in power. We're not a hospital provider or healthcare provider.
You're a great manufacturer.
We are manufacturer of technology and service provider. But it's critical. But it doesn't mean, to your point, that we just, build aircraft engine and we stop there. We build all kinds of turbines across the spectrum or diagnostic imaging and we stop there. And what we realize in Africa is that it's two things. Once, if you don't build the ecosystem around, delivering power, delivering health, and moving people, then you have very little chance to even sell your product. So you have to engage into the early development of an independent power project, exactly the same way you've described that, because together with usually EPC contractors, we're the key component of both the economics of a project, because at the end of the day, you need to generate the kilowatt in a sustainable, reliable manner over 25 years under the PPA. If you don't, then you don't get your economics. Same thing for health. If your CT scans or MRs or ultrasound or X-ray machine do not scan at a normal rhythm, then you do that and set aside aircraft engine. It's in terms of safety and reliability, it's there. So our role is critical to deliver the economics of a project, go back to Matt's feasibility, and the outcome. We're very much focused on the outcome. And if our journey over the last 10 years has been to localize our capabilities, this is very much to enable the sustainable outcome development of all of these sectors. Because you can be a developer and invest equity, you can build a hospital, but it doesn't mean it's gonna really deliver the outcome, which is basic outcomes. I mean, if you don't deliver health every day, You can build a hospital, but a hospital does not deliver health. What delivers health is good healthcare providers with clinical standards and good technology companies that enable long-term service and maintenance, training, capability building. So this is truly the role we're doing. So back to your question, we're ready to seed early investment, and we've done so in terms of, do we like to be majority equity holder in IPP? No. But we'll put the seeds of early equity investment or development costs to enable that IPP get off the ground, because we believe in that solution. We've done that in Bridge Power in Ghana to prove the gas to power concept in the continent, which is the first one, because we believe we can replicate that in many other places. And we've done so alongside. We've put some early development in healthcare project on the primary care side, because we believe that revitalizing the primary care space in most of the countries of Africa where the referral system is not efficient is the place to tackle universal health coverage in collaboration with national health insurance schemes that will pay for that. So developing that at the right cost, it's not about building fancy hospital or healthcare facilities, it's about delivering at cost point sustainably that will enable the budgets to pay for that.
Okay.
So that's
great answer. Yeah, that's where I was trying to get at. You are not just a manufacturer. You do invest money in development, and then you partner with the right companies. Shankar, I'm going to give you the easy question. Okay.
What's my name? Oh, God. It's okay.
We all hear, for the last few years, we've heard this phrase, slogan, which is actual risk versus perceived risk. And that's, there's no doubt that that's true, that the perception of risk in places, particularly in America, to be quite frank, in Africa is completely out of line with the reality of being here and often doing business here. But there is risk. There is no doubt about that. And again, what I want to do is to more talk like operationalizing. How do you operationalize the perceived risk element? How do you get to a stage where you can transform the way funds, like Shankar's fund, think about investing in Africa? So perhaps you could talk a bit about risks, and we don't have to go through all of them, but the process and the big risks and the sort of the no deal risk, deal breaker risks.
Yeah. First of all, the actual versus perceived risk. Perception is reality, so there is no difference between actual and perception. And the second point I would make is the same stuff used to be talked about in Asia 20, 30 years ago. Actual versus perceived risk in China 30 years ago. Actual versus perceived risk in India 20 years ago. Actual versus perceived risk in Vietnam 5 years ago. I think the very important thing is, I think there's a knowledge gap. So the more we can bridge that knowledge gap, we can reduce that gap between actual and perceived. The second is there needs to be some demonstration effect. Success begets success. The more success stories we can have of people investing in Africa and making money, that will make a sea change to the investment outlook for the continent. When we look at Africa, obviously, I like the fact that people from outside of Africa think the risk here is very high, because for me, it's a great opportunity. So I want that gap to continue, selfishly, because the moment that gap is bridged, actually there'll be a flood of capital.
That's where I work, actually, too.
Right. And the problem with investing is, particularly if you're sitting in US or Japan or anywhere else, there are so many great opportunities around the world, and Africa is competing for capital. The question is the pain worth the gain? Is the size of the prize big enough that you're willing to put in the hard yards to gain that knowledge? And I really compliment, I don't think Dick Ingram and Dan Miller and America are here, but some of the big US pension funds are now putting in that hard yards. I know Dick has been to Africa, 3 or 4 times in the last year or so.
They have a panel at 10:30. Right after
speaking.
this one, those pension funds.
Yeah, go straight
have a
from
panel.
here because Dick is a great speaker and he's a lot of fun. Okay, he says a lot of politically incorrect things, which is great in a nice way. So coming back to your question, look, when we look at Africa, we love the story, but there is no substitute for putting in the hard yards and doing your due diligence. And I would categorize 4 areas of risk that we look at very closely, more so in Africa than elsewhere. One is exchange risk, because currency volatility can kill a dollar fund. You can make all the return you want in Nairas or in Rand, but when you got to return that money to JICA or to OPEC in dollars, you're toast. So exchange risk is something that is very important in our analysis. The second is exit risk, because as a private equity fund, we have a limited lifespan to each fund. Typically somewhere, let's say, max 10 years, but our typical investment period would be 5 to 7 years. How do we exit? The challenge in Africa is the capital markets are not deep and liquid enough once you get out of Johannesburg. So unless it's a sale to a strategic, your forms of exit are much less than, say, in Asia. So exit. The third area that I think there's more risk in Africa than elsewhere and therefore requires a due diligence is what I call execution risk. Because a lot of the entrepreneurs here are first generation. They simply don't have the bench strength and the people capability. There are exceptions, and there are countries where there are exceptions. I'm speaking in the absolute rather than in the 54 countries in Africa and so on. But there is clearly a degree of execution risk more here in Africa, because also the governments are notorious in terms of changing the goalposts sometimes. That introduces a heightened degree of execution risk. And the last point, I would say, which is even more important than the exchange risk and the exit risk and the execution risk, is who are we investing with? The entrepreneur in question. For us, the know who is even more important than the know-how of investing. So it's the 4 E's: execution, exchange, exit, and entrepreneur.
Cool. Thank you. Matt.
Can I just chime in on that really quick? Because Shakar, thank you so much for jumping on my big talking point. So that's fantastic. I'm just playing.
I saw your notes.
I know, you still got inside my briefcase. Well done, sir. No, I think that touches on a key point, though, right? Is that this idea of perceived versus real risk. One of the things we've been working on in Africa for decades, but most recently over the last 5 years, is the idea of identifying bankable deals. It wasn't so much that once you had a deal, that deal was just overtly risky and could never be accomplished. It was, there's a lot of good capital looking for a home, just not a lot of good deals to get behind. And I have to say, most of the donors, USG included, had been doing it wrong. We'd internalized that development and the business development assistance to entrepreneurs and to businesses to help get them to a place of a bankable deal. So I think the shift under Prosper Africa, started up under Power Africa, is to work with local developers, local institutions to help get identified deals and bring those deals to bankability. I can say under the Trade and Investment Hub platforms in the last 3 years, using when available local investors and local business developers, they've got a pipeline now and have executed deals about $400 million in SMEs working across borders looking to export. Similar model for Power Africa, and similar to last with those 6 pension fund investors. That's the mark, right? Show how it's done. They've committed almost $1 billion over the last months. That's a very small, humble bit of the potential behind the U.S. capital markets. If we can convince more investors like them of all the pension funds of the United States to invest just 1% of their total holdings, that's $70 billion. $70 billion is 1% of U.S. pension funds in capital markets. They've already committed $1 billion. It's up to you to provide them the opportunities and engage. So please do attend the next panel as well.
Did you want to say something, Ferry?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think it's, that's a big, when you're in a global company, perceived risks, when you have to sell something to your investment committee or your board in terms of investment. But you need to flip, particularly in Africa, the paradigm here or the logic. You need to say, I'm going to master the risk. So what do I need to really put the risk in my hand, take the fate in my hand, and make the risks much lesser or mitigated to what they seem to be or what they are currently. And that's what we chose to do in GE. Because when you deliver a power plant, when you deliver a full turnkey hospital in terms of built, and same thing on aviation or oil and gas and transportation, you need to make sure that what you're doing is gonna work. And you put the capabilities in front of that. So localization of your execution capabilities is key. It's key for us because then, we can take the commitment to a developer about availability, about uptime, not in 1 year, in 2 years, or in 5-year span as a private equity, but in 25-year span. Yep. So if you can do that, you invest in your expertise, in your ability to mitigate the risks, then I think you create value for the project, for the outcome, and then you can drag the investors, because the lenders are going to say, oh, GE is doing a turnkey on this. They're taking the performance risks over 25 years. And that makes, we have a recourse, we have a way to mitigate our own risks, so when they go to their own credit committees, they can get approved. Now, we're not going to mitigate the FX risk. It's true. So macroeconomically, you will still be faced when and we're a dollar-based company as well when we consolidate, but when I do business here, I do business in Rand. I do business in Naira. So we've learned also as a global company to just do business in the local
work with
currency.
those exchange rates.
I would just say a word because I've been listening to what Matt and Emma and Maury have been saying. What we need in terms of going back to your first question, we can seed investment, we can put a little bit of equity, development cost, sub-debt to get other lenders to come or private equity investors. I think what you need in Africa, you need really that patient investors, longer term investors, because the cycle to bring a project from origination to financial close is quite long. And then during operations, you can go through roadblocks in terms of your return, in terms of the way it's going to deliver outcome. Okay. So patient risk, patient capital is really what we need.
Okay. We're running out of time. So there's a couple of other things that we talked about. I talked about at the beginning that there's the large-scale deals, most of which we're talking at the moment. I met an interesting lady here in the last 24 hours. And she's running with actually a US company from DC. She's running an incubator here. She's got 100 startup companies. And that 100 startup companies go to her organization and they get an office, get space to work, and they have mentoring. They're told how to do business, how to make money, et cetera, et cetera. And Gamu, are you here? Yeah, stand up a second. So here's my question to the governments in particular. Are you able to support people like Gamu at the lower end of the scale in terms of dollars to make the new businesses, the startup businesses of the future, this is in South Africa, are you able to work at that end of the scale and support them too? So ask Emma first.
So I think it's a really great question because I hear so often this whole piece around, if you want $100 million, no problem. If you want $50 million or less, you're going to struggle. And if you want, if you just need a cool million, just to kind of provide that investment capital to turn your one-person organisation into hiring 3 extra people, which if every entrepreneur in Africa was able to do that, that would be massively impactful. There is this problem, the missing middle, or whatever we want to call it. So I mean, I think to answer that, I think I would point to the real challenge of it, but I think the responsibility for governments to to help solve that problem. I think because we're all so focused on supporting economic development, creating jobs, meaningful, valuable jobs, not just for today but for the future. And I think that entrepreneur space is absolutely critical for it. So we do things to work with interlocutors, if you like, to kind of support that ability to move a big chunk of cash from the UK government into smaller bite-sized pieces to support a plethora of smaller and mid-sized businesses. And we work with organisations like the London Stock Exchange Group, who have an initiative with PwC and Asoko Insight into, they call it Companies to Inspire Africa. And that's looking particularly at SMEs, the fastest growing, most exciting companies on the continent, of which there are many thousands. And the few hundred that get into that final report are those that have gone through the due diligence and are kind of investor ready. And it's about sort of, using sort of big institutions to highlight the investment opportunities to connect those really exciting SME companies that we know are good business propositions but are struggling to get those smaller amounts of money. So it's about working with those existing opportunities.
So just because of time, yes or no? Maury and Matt, can you help GAMU and people like GAMU at that end? Actually, yes or no?
Yes or no? Yes. We can invest to that fund support for that SME or microfinance institutions. Establish that one. That's in not yes Asia or no. For women. I'd like to work some organization like that, the Blue Orchard, to establish supporting the fund in Africa, if we have a chance.
Great, thank you. Matt?
The President's Global Women's Entrepreneurship Program and the African Women Entrepreneurship Program that's been going on more readily for years allows me to say readily yes. Okay.
So there's one transaction. We got one. Okay, so I don't know how many minutes we've got left, but let's throw it over to the floor and take some questions. You put your hand up first, the gentleman here.
Halma Price from the Bricks Post. A question for Maury. JICA has been involved in supporting one-stop border posts for many years. Can you give us a progress report as to what's happening, and especially in terms of Kazangula Bridge? Thanks.
Okay, this gentleman behind you, a second.
Okay, my name is Jama. I work for a company called Trucks Transit Parks Limited. We're based in Lagos. My question is 3, but let me just give you a 30-minute background. 30 seconds. Sorry, 30 minutes, we won't leave it.
15.
All right.
15.
Nigeria loses about $50 billion annually due to our inefficient port system. And the port I'm referring to is just one port that is located in Lagos. This inefficiency also results from an inefficient truck traffic management. Now, my company, based on the experience of the promoters, have designed a solution which has gone through a government-sponsored fast-track program. We are now at the point of execution. So my question is this. Number one, to what extent will my project be attractive to USDDA, JICA, and CDC if I have very little or no foreign content? So now this project is going to involve 90% of the cost will go to cement, sand, and steel, and I can source this locally from Nigeria. The rest are security equipment, which form just 10%, and I may also source these from Nigeria. So how attractive would this project be? We've gotten an engagement with USDDA last year, and apart from the feasibility study offer, they also said the equipment that are going to be used for this project should have a significant US content. Now, I don't know if that is still part of the conditions.
Maybe you could talk about the US DFC?
Yes.
I think that's a good opening to talk about the DFC.
So the second is, what kind of security will the USDDA, CDC, and JICA be requiring for a project like this, especially if I don't have a parent company that can guarantee the loan, and I do not have a deep-pocketed promoter who is behind me? And the third is, if I have policy issues with the government, I think Shankar mentioned some of those, especially in Nigeria, to what extent can your organizations assist me to go through those government policy challenges to get the deal over the line?
Matt, perhaps you can talk about the new institution, which is the DFC, and its rules. And I think that, just a comment, the gentleman who just spoke, I mean, there are thousands and thousands of you all over Africa that I meet all the time that need that help. And that's exactly what I was talking about before. And I think the process is, first, you also need to find an equity partner, because without equity, you can't get debt. So you need an equity. So you need to go to Shankar and see, will Shankar's firm invest in your project, and do they like it? And then the two of you will go to Prosper Africa or Power Africa, whichever it is, and Matt will tell you now about the new Development Finance Corporation in the United States.
That's a keen observation, and he raised an important clarification about USTDA. USTDA must use a U.S. contracted person for the feasibility study, but also needs to demonstrate the potential for U.S. content in the longer deal. It's a potential. It's not a hard requirement. But I would suggest, even before going to the DFC, you're going to need a capital partner, as they recommended. This is exactly the type of opportunity that we would like to make introductions to you for working with U.S. firms. There's your content. It's in your capital partner that would help bring that finance and put you in a position of thinking about U.S. content and how to execute your deal. So that would be one way at a strategic level that you need not have to open the door completely to forego your autonomy on developing your project. But there's a ton of U.S. companies who would be keen and expert in developing that with you, and you can think about them as a capital partner rather than as an owner, that type of thing. The other way to talk about the new DFC, the new Development Finance Corporation, and Adam is also, the new CEO is also in the next panel as well, so I encourage you to attend. The new DFC was authorized under the BUILD Act back in Congress about 9 months ago. It calls for taking what has previously been OPIC, merging it with our guarantee facility called the Development Credit Authority, and creating a new Development Finance Corporation. It raises the ceiling from $30 billion to $60 billion globally. If you look at the historical portfolio of OPIC on the African continent, it's ranged plus and minus between 60 and 65%, so you can do the math on how much of that 60 billion should be attracted to the African continent. It comes with some wonderful additional authorities of also providing technical assistance to help deals that aren't quite there yet qualify and be of better interest and more bankable to a DFC look. And also, coupled with Prosper Africa, does exactly what I suggested, is rather than try to overcome a content requirement by making opportunities artificially, puts you in touch with a great partner from a U.S. side. There is no content requirement for the new Development Finance Corporation. It is a strong preference, but the content requirement that existed under OPIC will be removed once the DFC is fully fledged, and it will be a preference rather than a requirement.
Yes, so exactly what I'm saying is you approach a private equity firm or an investor to get that equity, first of all. And one point I'd like to make is that what I see all the time is that guys like you with great ideas, great projects, you approach an equity investor from outside, from UK, Europe, America, wherever, and you own 100% of that company on the day you approach them. And they do their due diligence and they check it and they say, yeah, this is a great investment. I'm going to make a decent return out of this. And then comes the crunch, because that private equity firm wants maybe 90% or 85% or 80% of the ownership. And so many deals get stuck there where the local party can't understand why these people who didn't do anything are coming in and now they want the lion's share. But unfortunately, that's just the way it is. And nothing much is going to change on that, because there's basically an arithmetic calculation based upon the money that's being put on the table. It's all about the money at the end of the day. And maybe Shankar, you can talk about how do you see, I mean, people must approach you all the time about investments in Africa. How do you see yourself when you come into an investment like that?
Look, obviously we have a fiduciary responsibility to the people who have given us the money, i.e. our limited partners, and we have indicated to them a certain return that we hope to make. Of course, if you're an infrastructure fund, your return requirement is quite different from a growth capital private equity fund and so on, or a VC fund. For us, we have to target a 20% dollar IRR, irrespective of whether it's in Africa or in Southeast Asia or UAE or wherever. So that's the sort of return we expect. The only other thing I would add to you is please get your cement from Dangote Cement. That's all.
Okay, another question. Gentleman at the front here.
My name is Samuel. We're one of the largest indigenous oil and gas company in Nigeria. We're big time into engineering. The Nigerian government have positioned
Which company?
Nigeria.
Which company?
Adona Engineering.
Okay.
The Nigerian government have positioned Nigeria, or is positioning Nigeria to be the gas hub for Africa. There are a lot of gas in Nigeria. We're here today just looking for good partners with deep pockets that can work with us in some of the bankable projects we've identified in Nigeria. But I also wanted to, plead to you, mostly to the U.S. government and the U.K. government, please, 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 when you sit with the African governments or some of the key people that you have access to, please help us. It's always a challenge to look for that seed money to put projects together to bankability, to bring a project to solid bankability. That is where we have a lot of problems in Africa. There are a lot of visions, ideas, but where do you get that $5 million, $10 million that can help you package that project so that when you sit with lenders, they go, wow, this is a sweet deal, I'm in. Thank you.
Okay, so Maury, we talked about your TD. Really, that's the answer you gave before, which is that you can do the seed money.
Yes, and actually that Nigeria as a country, Nigeria is one of the very attractive countries for that JICA to expand. And for that seed money, so once we should know, of course, that the project, but we cannot take that all the risk. So even though that seed money could be the fine to find out that our partner, like that AFDB, IFC, such kind of that combination give us that idea how we can cooperate with you for finding out that seed money.
Question? Over here. By the way, I was told, I thought to finish at 10 o'clock. I was just told we've got till 10:30, which is why I was rushing earlier on.
So I'll give you a bit of background. My name is David Ofungi from Kampala, Uganda. I met you, Paul, yesterday.
Hey, David.
Just a bit of background. I'm from the private sector, but I also have a government role. I serve on the Public-Private Partnership Board. And a personal story a little bit. So I'm from a large family, 8 kids, which kind of came in handy when the car broke down and we had to push it. But there was a challenge when we had to eat the one piece of chicken or one chicken. And it speaks a lot to the sort of conversation between infrastructure and the art of adding value to our local resources. So in a sense, I think there's a lot of work that's being done on the roads and power. Bloomberg had an article last week about the cost to the Ghanaian government of $450 million annually for surplus power that's not being used. And the same speaks to roads. I mean, there's PPPs that are talking about road tolls, but if there are no trucks moving product out, then the sustainability issue is a problem. And I think the solution to that is to industrialize. So we need to produce locally. We're involved in a project.
What's your question?
I'm gonna raise a question. So,
okay.
Just a bit of background. So the industrialization aspect is key to get local capacity to produce perhaps in partnership with some of the companies. So I think we're in a situation where the equity is sorted out. We have debt through Afrexim, but I think some of the expertise we need from the UK, Japan, and certainly the US is from the producers, the GEs, to come and establish facilities in country. I think down the road, the ability for us to seamlessly export produce that's made in Africa to your countries. So within the construct of your various agencies, do you have that back-end support in terms of getting product to your various jurisdictions? I think it's pretty much an open question.
Maybe Emma?
Yeah, so there's actually a lot of work going on from the UK government perspective to work with the grain of what we're seeing across different economies. So, for example, agro-processing, the beneficiation of commodities, minerals, and so on, to really to enable countries to sort of get maximum benefit from the resources that they have, people and minerals, etc. So one of the things that we've been hearing as we've gone around Africa over the last few years, in the context of the UK leaving the European Union, is can we change the trading arrangements, the framework that governs the way goods and services, or goods particularly, are exported from Africa to Europe. Because actually, it's largely duty-free, tariff-free if you've just got some basic commodities. But if you're looking to beneficiate and get more value from that, then let's slap on some tariffs and some duties and quotas to make that harder to be competitive then in the international market. And I think as global leaders of free trade, I think we're really keen to continue to have that conversation around how we support that drive to export more, to produce products that can be exportable to a variety of international markets. We have programs in place to help with some of that, but I think some of it as well is around the wider trading framework to provide the right incentives to enable those products that are created to be more easily exported.
Paul, just, it's me. That's for you.
I'm sorry, yeah. I was looking
No, just on one aspect of the question, because related to, power and electricity, and, we're putting a lot of effort here in Africa over the last few years working on grid solution, transmission and distribution. And this is key because, to your point, we can keep on creating generation here and there, but if we don't take that to where it needs to be consumed for processing, for manufacturing, for basic consumption, then we're going to have a problem. And I think, some of the multilateral, the World Bank, the African Development Bank has been very involved in funding those kind of grid solutions right now. But I think looking at Prosper Africa, looking at UKEF and others, there is something to be done to really have a big focus on what are the cross-country grid, big transmission work that we can do. And then, particularly within the free trade agreement within the African Union, this is really one of the biggest problems. I mean, Nigeria is probably the largest problem we face today. We've done ourselves 4,000 megawatt of private development in IPP, a little bit like you described. But, a lot of that is trapped because of the grid today. And I think this is the kind of solution we need to work, and we need, the funding, not just looking at content, but looking at who's bringing the long-term benefit, and if there is a US company to qualify for, then we're ready to be there. I think with UKEF being as flexible as you've been, we're starting to be able to work on those solutions, but that should be the thought process for the bigger picture.
That fortunately is a subject I know a little bit about, power. And before I let Matt speak, what I would say is that, again, looking from 50,000 feet, it's clear today that the grid It needs to be built out, particularly, as you say, in Nigeria. But not just Nigeria, many countries. Madagascar is a country bigger than France and has 23, 24 million people. There's no electricity grid at all, nothing. At least there's something in Nigeria. So the grid is necessary. But I agree.
Largest economy in Africa. Everybody wants to come to Nigeria. Nigeria is excited. But we need you guys to work with us to be able to solve these challenges, like the gentleman from GE.
Yeah.
Please, I'm begging you to come and help us. We need help.
Let me make my point. My point is that there's a grid side, and now, in recent years, there's an off-grid side. And there's a lot of mini-grids going around Africa. And frankly, that's the only way some people are ever going to get electricity. But for me, there's a fundamental issue at the moment. We're bringing the mini-grids to Africa, but we're selling, in those cases, mostly power to the poorest people of Africa. So the cost has to come down. Absolutely. Somehow, we have to make those tariffs so low that it takes off like mobile phones did. Until that happens, and it will not happen with a solar PV array that is backed up by a diesel generator at night, which costs 45 cents to 50 cents per kilowatt hour to run. So you need the solar on its own, great, but the sun goes down at 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, whatever. So when that happens, and people talk about batteries, and again, I know a lot about the battery thing. Batteries, even in the United States and UK and everything, they're still early. So they're still expensive. Eventually, they will come down too, and that will be the game changer. When batteries are affordable, that will be a game changer. But anything that can be done to reduce the cost to the public of that electricity is what we should all be aiming for. So anyway, that was the subject I know about. So,
I was just going to touch on the original question from the gentleman in around the building out of the infrastructure, and then the implication that then we should try to figure out how to best utilize that infrastructure. And I think it touches on something Fareed said early on, is that I think the approach needs to be fundamentally changed. And a lot of that circles back to the flavor of money that's going into the building of that infrastructure. GE takes an approach that we are in it for life, right? They are advancing a deal knowing well that their equipment will be sold, but it's a partnership, it's a relationship, and they're in it for the long haul. I think the funding of infrastructure in Africa, traditionally having relied heavily on debt and public sector expenditure and central banks in order to augment and advance the infrastructure development in Africa, has led us fundamentally to where we're at today. A misalignment of equities and a construction of a project rather than a relationship for life, right? So this is why I get so very excited about the private sector's role and the private capital markets of the U.S. in coming in, and the offer of Power Africa and the offer of Prosper Africa and our colleagues from other countries, is that this is a signal that there's a choice. And that choice has to be augmented and pushed and advocated and voiced on every level across U.S. and England and Japan private sector and African private sector, that this misalignment of equities in the investment of African infrastructure, whether it be supporting agriculture or energy or transmission or roads, has to come into an alignment, or will forever be circling back into coming up against a debt ceiling where you can no longer have a permissible environment for future investment. So let's commit here today to do that together, and that private sector capital drive the sustainable development of African infrastructure and growth, along benefiting each of our countries mutually with our private sector partners.
So you're committing that too. So there's our second intangible transaction.
But you know what, Matt, one of the things that I find so interesting about the way UK companies are doing business in Africa is very much that model. So it's not just kind of coming here, hey, I've got a product, I've got a service, this is how I've sold it in the UK or in the US or somewhere else. Here, have it or not. Actually, it's about coming here, it's about building the relationships, creating the trust, because actually, you know, people do business, not companies, not governments, but it's about the investing for the long term, the patient bit, but it's also about listening. And I think, you know, the companies that I work with that are most successful and are seeing the biggest returns on their investment and the greatest expansion of their business here in Africa are the ones that are coming and they are listening, and they're taking the time to understand what is the environment within which they're looking to do business, and how can they adapt and flex their business model in a way that will work for them, because ultimately this is business, you've still got to make some money, but you don't have to make this much money, you can still be satisfied with making this much money and doing good business in the right way with local partners and in a way that invests in local capabilities, local supply chains, to building a win-win business model. Sounds a bit, I suppose it's positive and naive perhaps, but that is the way that UK companies are increasingly doing business here in Africa.
That's changing the risk perception.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mima, I'll come to you next.
Thank you. Mima Nedeljkovic, I'm chairman of the Africa Global Schaefer Group. We've been in agribusiness, agro-industry, agro-processing over 50 years on the continent. So I want to come back to the agro-process question, because the issue basically when you're operating in the boonies, before that grid gets here, I guarantee you the technology and the battery costs will come down before the grid arrives where we are by and large. So I would very much support the whole mini-grid, off-grid processing. And then let's look at what can be balanced with the sun at the nighttime, whether it's biomass, water, et cetera. Now the question I have really for the panel, especially the donors side of it, is the recognition finally that there is a real private sector in Africa, and I've spent my last 6 years here. You're now looking at opportunities, DFC is one of them, the other opportunities in JICA, to really be able to support not just trade. We used to say trade, not aid. Now we finally understand it's not just trade, not aid. It's trade and investment and not aid. So I think if we can come back to some of that, I think that really hits to some of the issues that the African colleagues are having. We're trying to find the right sort of mix and investment. And also recognition, I suppose, on our side, as Paul was saying, when the money comes, gold calls the shots. So that's the golden rule. So what we need to give away in order to make the deal happen, we need to give it away. But let's make sure the deals happen.
And here's me thinking you were only 45 years old, me. I'd like to put a point, before I'm going to come to this gentleman here, I'd like to put a point to, again, I think it's the government people that need to listen to this one, is that particularly in America and perhaps in Japan, my question to you is, what are you going to do at home, not in Africa, at home, to convince good companies from Japan? We know many of them. Good companies from America, good companies from UK, Europe, to come to Africa and invest. Of course, they have all this. There needs to be an effort in country, I think, to make that happen. Maury, maybe you could say something.
Yes. First, as I mentioned, that we had a TICAT this August, and we had a seminar inviting so many Japanese companies. I really feel that they have moving interest to Africa, clearly. Particularly that one is renewable energy and off-grid, and the other is agriculture. And they start to make some investment to some company, making that connection, and cooperation with them, try to invest, to try to find a good business with business. And we really wish to support such a movement.
Okay, Matt?
That's a great question. To me, that's kind of the fundamental, right? Is we count on 10, 20 U.S. companies that can celebrate 100 years in Africa. That's fantastic. Well done. Completely insufficient in order to change the relationship that our private sector has with Africa. So when I say that Prosper Africa Consortia of 16 U.S. government agencies, the lead agency and really carrying a lot of water in all this is the U.S. Foreign Commercial Service and Department of Commerce. And Deputy Secretary Kelly is here again, her third time on the continent in the last 6 months, promoting Prosper Africa. It's the U.S. Export Assistance Centers, over 100 of them based all throughout the United States that are the touch points for U.S. companies. We've got a lot of work to do. We have to convince them that the African marketplace, maybe of today, but of 2030 and 2040 and 2050, warrants their attention today. Because right now, it's not the risk so much, it's the scale of the market and the knowledge of the African marketplace that is probably the greatest prohibitor, right? Because if you're a U.S. company already exporting to, say, the UK, your next market is the EU or Asia or Latin America unfortunately, before you come to Africa, unless you have some type of motivation. And we have to serve as that motivation. So help us promote deals that are getting done with the assistance of the U.S. government. Help us promote deals that are getting done without any government touch, because that is really the strongest message that we can send. And I encourage you, sorry, Paul, I encourage you all to swing by the Prosper Africa and Power Africa booth. There is the U.S. government toolkit of all these tools that I've been talking about, and a one-page glossy. It'll be online as well. But it's going to rely on all of us here in this room to help pull those U.S. companies and additional U.S. companies over to the African market.
So you're committing to Prosper Africa and the Department of Commerce to make an effort in the United States, around the country, perhaps through commerce, to promote the opportunities in Africa.
We have already done the Small Business Development Centers in Los Angeles, 1,000 participants, developing global markets in Houston, Department of Commerce led, 400 participants. We will continue to hammer the message that Africa is the marketplace where we all should be paying attention.
Great. That's another intangible transaction, I think. This gentleman's been patient.
Could I just add in just a couple of quick points from the UK perspective? Because I think you're absolutely right that it's about investment, not just trade. And we had traditionally been looking very much at export support, but realised in looking at that actually an increasing number of those export deals are actually also to do with investment. So whether it's the likes of Unilever creating local factories, or GSK producing local pharmaceutical production facilities, Diageo, known in Kenya as East African Breweries, investing hugely in Kenya to produce local jobs, local content, locally sourced products. But I think so from the UK perspective, we have our UK Africa Investment Summit in London in January, very much about showcasing success, because businesses hear what other businesses have done, and we want to create that strong sense of competition within the UK business community by showcasing successful investments and saying, well, yeah, your direct competitors are doing this and they're making some good cash out of it, as well as doing the right thing. So why aren't you? And creating it, success breeds success.
And I think that it's not all about the big names either, the Unilevers. There's so many companies in the US, Japan, UK, Scotland, all around, oil and gas. They don't even think about the opportunities in Africa, but you can make a lot more money in Africa if you get it right. So that's what I think should happen. Now, you've been so patient, sir. Go ahead.
I'll be very quick now. My name is Dele Babade. I'm a Pan-African financier. I've done this for about 25 years with various institutions. I'm going back to what you said at the start of this, that your moderator panel, you were told to come up with concrete pointers to people. And you mentioned, I think when the Nigerian chap was talking about his new business, that there are thousands of people like him looking for capital. I think the most important thing is to be able to provide, what would I say, real concrete pointers to not just you, but everybody else like you who's looking for support. Shankar mentioned that his fund has fiduciary obligations to the people that provide the funds, but they don't do startups. So 20 years ago, we struggled to find anything above 12 months money for African businesses. That's changed. 10 years ago, there were very few private equity companies in Africa. That's changed. But the key issue really now that we're finding with a lot of, and I think it's very useful for people to know this, is what we have, what I call the ground up, the project and the development capital, the most risky part of the capital. Not bank debt, not the private equity, but really, really the ground up. The stuff that helps the people, beyond just the money, but also the capacity to be able to write the business plans and everything else. So I just wondered whether Shankar and Ms. Wade-Smith could provide some pointers, given CDC or some of the other DFIs in this area. Because this is really what's going to move the needle. The more we have of this early stage stuff, which is not just the risk capital, but also the hand-holding, the better it will be.
They're telling me we're going to have to finish just now. So does one of you want to make Shankar, do you want to make a quick response to that?
No, I think, Dele, your point is absolutely right, because you need capital for every stage of the life cycle of a project or a company. And but I think if I heard what my esteemed colleagues from JICA and Prosper Africa and Emma said, I think the governments are extremely aware of this issue and are providing the facilities for this. That's what I heard. Yeah. But the other area, Dele, I would add is also I think Africa needs some venture capital funds, because the other side of it is there's a digital Africa and you need VC funds.
Okay. I'm going to make one last request of, again, particularly the governments and the private sector. Is it possible? I know you already cooperate with each other, but can we see even more cooperation, particularly between these three governments, the US, Japan, and UK, to make projects happen? Maybe there'll be projects where you work together and that sort of thing. And to have more conversations in general with the private sector, with us. Will you commit to doing that? And if you do, that's my 4th transaction. Or 3.
Yes, by all means. Do you want a long answer or a short answer?
No, that was it. I wanted to make the point, I think, and we spoke about it yesterday. I think it's great to have particularly the three governments, and I really like Japan getting involved in this private sector stuff now. I think you should talk more. So on that note, I'm going to finish. It's been very nice. It was longer than I thought. It's been very nice having you all here. Go and enjoy the rest of the conference. And thank you to my really great panel. I appreciate it.